So in the last teaching, we were developing the understanding of the dialectic of the drives. And it was mentioned that the philosopher Hegel was the author of that concept. But it was a philosopher who came shortly after Hegel who represents the break between the classical modernity, if you will, versus the modernity that would lead to the postmodern, that is represented by the shift from Hegel to Nietzsche. And so tonight it's Nietzsche that I want to discuss with you, because he's one of the great geniuses of the Western philosophical tradition and analytic achievement of understanding of the inner labyrinth of consciousness, whose foresight as to what is happening now in the world is unparalleled by any other thinker. Hegel, we could say, was the last Christian thinker, at least nominally Christian. But for Nietzsche, Christianity was a monstrosity. It was a corruption and a perversion of the teachings of Christ. And so Nietzsche wanted to leave Christianity behind and return to Christ, to the real teachings of Yeshua. And he went very deeply into that understanding and into the relationship of Greece to Jerusalem, because it was through the filter of Greek and Roman culture that Christianity both suffered its perversion when it was taken over by the Roman Empire, that then used it in order to not only destroy all the other wisdom schools along the way, all the Greek schools, but later on, of course, with its Inquisition, to destroy all of the threats to the empire. And it was a tool of the empire to enslave the people, not an instrument for liberation as Christ's own teachings were. And if nothing else, Nietzsche was a great spiritual anarchist who wanted to return to freedom. But he also saw that freedom present in the Greek culture, at least among some of its philosophers, its great philosophers. And its great artists, its playwrights. And so his first book was a book on Greek philosophy, and it was actually the birth of tragedy through the spirit of music. Nietzsche was also a great musician. Many people don't realize that. He's an extraordinary composer. You can hear his music is online. Extraordinary compositions of great depth and power. And he recognized that the Greeks were very aware of the power of music. If you go back to Pythagoras, the whole universe is music. It is a spectrum, an octave of vibrational frequencies. And they were very much aware of how the different frequencies would affect the soul and invoke different drives within the human heart. So his first book was an analysis of how the art form of tragedy developed as a means of displaying for the people the inner journey of a soul through its own dark night in order to discover its own antithetical nature, its lower drives, and have to do battle with them in order to slay that which was inferior, to be able to be victorious and able to express the truth of our godly nature, of our partaking of the good, the one, the absolute, through manifesting one of the forms, the archetypes of that infinite consciousness in our lives, and becoming a manifestation, an avatar of that archetypal beauty and truth. And he recognized that it was this art form of tragedy itself that represented the soul's capacity to take the drives that were in conflict at the ego level and turn them into convergent drives that would produce the highest art. And that this was the flower of human culture, to produce an artwork that would perform and express the entire spectrum of the struggle within each soul to become liberated. And so he discovered that the mythology of Greece was a coded expression of the relationship of the different human drives. And that the two most important drives were those that were called Apollo and Dionysus. And Dionysus was that desire for freedom that would suffer the tragic resistance of a culture that wasn't able to bear its truth and its power and its breaking of the molds of conventional morality and belief systems, and would be martyred or would be in some way forced into the position of Prometheus, who by stealing the fire of the gods had to suffer having his liver eaten by the crow or whatever that bird of prey was that they sicked on him. So it was the convergence, the alliance of Apollo and Dionysus that the soul was able to achieve that created the possibility of producing a work of art that would resolve all of these internal conflicts and express their resolution for the community as a whole. Apollo represented the spirit of art, the structures of consciousness, the incredible discipline required to produce a play or a symphony or some other art form. And Dionysus, the freedom to bring the wildness of complete non-structured pouring out of creative intelligence and love into that artwork. And it was only when both of these drives were unified that great art could be produced. So it was Nietzsche, who, by the way, he was born in 1844, and his father was a Lutheran pastor. He grew up in a very Christian atmosphere. And like Ramana, he lost his father at a young age, even younger. He was only 4. And this was one of the great searches for the name of the Father, if you will, the word of the Father. And so his love for Christ was very deep. Many people think of him as being anti-Christian, but only in terms of the religion that perverted the teachings, not of Christ. And so he was very much involved in that, and then he integrated that with his love for Greek culture and philosophy, and he became the earliest chair of the Department of Philology at the University of Leipzig, and in which he was a teacher of Greek and Latin literature and philosophy. But then his own inner journey took him so deep he could no longer remain within the academic world. His writing broke through the traditional form that philosophy would take, and he was not interested in the kinds of pseudo-philosophy that are here nowadays, of logic and analytic philosophy and philosophy of science and all of that. He wanted to go to the depth of the meaning of human consciousness. And so in that, he left into a world of solitude in which he plummeted into the delirium of the depth of his subconscious, and he attained through his own inner struggle in the labyrinth, the superconscious nature. And so his life was a beautiful process of following Ariadne's thread through the labyrinth to discover and slay the Minotaur. But he got wounded by the Minotaur along the way, as everyone does who actually engages in that battle. And he turned those wounds into philosophy and into music. Along the way, he became an ally of Wagner, who he thought also was bringing a musical renaissance to not only Germany, but to the world. But then he felt that Wagner also began to corrupt his vision, and he had to leave Wagner as well. And then he lost all his friends, and he was really in a very solitary and lonely state, and really no one understood him. But in his struggles, he, I think unwittingly, rediscovered the insights of Taoism. You can see exact phrases almost that come from Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu in his writings. And in his final stage in the 1880s, he achieved Wu Wei, which was his ultimate goal, to have a consciousness that was totally free of intention, that was just a pure vehicle for the outpouring of truth. And then he reached a final level in which he went beyond language, and he realized he was done. He had graduated. He had realized the self. And in that moment, he knew that he had to leave behind philosophy and the whole world of symbolic truth to be saturated by the real. And because Germany had no ashrams at that time, the closest thing he could find was an insane asylum, which, as you know, is very similar to an ashram, if not identical. And so he found a very comfortable one, and in order to make sure they admitted him, he was reading a book by Dostoevsky. He was reading Crime and Punishment, and there was a scene in there where Raskolnikov, the hero, did something that got him busted, and he did the same act. With trying to protect a horse that was being flogged by a driver, etc. Anyway, he went mad, quote unquote, and indeed they took him to this asylum, and he was very happy there. They had beautiful gardens, and he walked and he was in a meditative state. And the few friends he still had visited him, and they all came back and said very publicly, he's feigning madness. He's not mad. He's totally lucid, but he's done with the symbolic level. He's Jivan Mukti. You know, they didn't use that word, but it was the equivalent of that. And they recognized this was divine madness. It was not psychosis. And he completed his journey. And so he's one of the great figures of the modern age, one of the few sages that we can look to, although he's totally misunderstood by most people, called a Nazi and anti-religious and all of that, but none of that is actually true. So, in any case, all of that is a prologue. to a preamble that I'll now begin, which is